and I'm from DSM Fine Chemicals, spread out between Austria and the Netherlands. And the title of my talk is From Root Scouting to Process Scouting, the development of sustainable fine chemicals processes. So I'll talk quickly about who is DSM, and then on the question whether fine chemicals production will be sustainable, whether we can do that tomorrow and in generations to come. And then about how we find improved routes, how we derive improved processes, and how we use our capabilities to improve on the sustainability of these processes, and then give some examples on how we do that. So quickly, who is DSM? If there's one thing significant about this company, it has been its ability to change. Actually, the M in DSM is from mining. So we started about 100 years ago to mine coal. So in 1902, there was a coal field and a company digging up coal. We quickly found that this wouldn't be sustainable, so we went into different businesses, into fertilizers, then petrochemicals and performance materials. And in doing that, we had to learn additional competencies. And that's probably the hallmark of DSM's fame, constantly learning additional competencies. Lately, we went into life sciences and now also into biomaterials and biologics. So what would a typical business process at DSM Pharma Chemicals look like? So a partner developing, for example, a new medicine would ask us to produce an intermediate or an active pharmaceutical active. So either they would ask us, hey, couldn't you do a single step for us? It's such a nasty step, we don't have an idea. Or else a partner would ask us to come up with a whole synthesis of a whatever complicated chemical. What would we do then? We would have a look at the volume, at the complexity of the chemistry, does it fit with us, is there competition, and so on and so forth. And we would then decide to enter a sort of root scouting, look whether there is foreign intellectual property, whether we could provide our customers with own intellectual properties, and so on and so forth. And then go into what we call process development or scale-up, do some safety considerations, think about plant configurations. What would that cost? A route is worthless if you cannot afford running it. And if further demand will pop up or the volume and price will be okay with us, we will go into additional rounds of further improving that. So that's a typical business project, starting with route scouting, going into full-scale production. So is this complicated? Has this changed over time? It definitely has, because today's small molecules have much more complex structures than they used to have. And these structures are created by ever longer sequences of chemical steps involving all kinds of hazardous materials and so on. And our customers, among them, for example, large pharma houses, become increasingly aware of the environmental effects and implications of what they're doing. Just compare, this is aspirin, one chemical step, say 1.5 or 1 in a purification, sulfadiazine 50 years later, probably 3 or 4 steps, and then you have aliskiren in 27. Depending on how you count it, something between up to 22 steps, the connoisseur will recognize 4 chiral centers, and this is, of course, a lengthy synthesis. So, and that's where our route scouting kicks in. We analyze the route where various starting materials, A, B, E, and so on, enter the route for weaknesses. For example, this might be a specifically nasty or hazardous material. And there might be a low-yielding step in there that would require us to source or produce large amounts, unduly large amounts of one starting material, or there would be an unselective reaction in the middle of that, meaning at the one hand low yield, on the other hand high efforts to purify the material, and at the end what happens all too often, there might be a wasteful purification, yeah? Leaving you with almost nil of your final product. So When it comes to hazardous materials, of course, that adds safety costs and logistics costs. You got to transport, store those hazardous materials. The low yields, unselective steps, and wasteful purifications are sources of losses and waste and render processes unsustainable. So everybody who has better solutions to that will have a more competitive process. So how does this fit our competencies? So when it comes to hazardous materials, why don't we produce them directly, in situ, on demand, by a flow process, and avoid handling and storage of hazardous materials, have it exactly where you need it, produced on the spot. When it comes to unselective reaction, why do all that protection chemistry and so on? If you have a selective catalyst, if you have a selective biocatalyst, you don't have a need for protective groups. You have improved selectivity and a much simpler purification. After all, we also go for completely redesign of routes, for example, from renewable starting materials, adding to the sustainability of our products. In doing that, and to be able to do that, we have an impressive toolbox of different techniques to enable us to do that. For example, industrial biocatalysis, we'll hear a lot about this later in other talks by Elise Meulenbrooks. We do have a broad collection of off-the-shelf enzymes, and we have an excellent expression system, to produce those enzymes. We have a secure supply of enzymes by in-house factories. And we have, of course, a track record, also regulatory in large-scale implementation. So I myself implemented one 200 tons per year process, and it shows up as one line here. This one. Yeah. So same to homogeneous catalysis. We have facilities of high throughput screening. We have custom-made catalysts. We can do all kinds of aromatic substitutions or couplings, and the option to expand the screening beyond that to kinetics and even beyond that into processes. When it comes to flow chemistry, that's my key competence at the moment. We do have flow process development from lab to pilot and further to full-scale plant. We integrate reactions and workup. We have a scheme of rapid reaction optimization and numbering up of the reactors to the desired throughput. And we can do all this under CGMP conditions. So, why is this so special to go beyond route scouting into process counting? There's one reason, because the design and the scale-up of this sustainable process is a multidisciplinary effort. That's what we have learned during our chemistry studies. Some chemical transformation, you look at the reaction order, the kinetics, A goes to product, or 2A might be to product, and from this you derive a sort of reaction rate, energy demand, energy release. How does the rate change with concentrations, temperature, and so on? And from that, you derive the features that the reactor should have to be able to handle that reaction. That the field leaves organic chemistry. Organic chemists don't care about their reactors. They have round-bottomed glass flasks, don't they? And what you have to know all of a sudden is heat transfer, mixing times, Reynolds numbers. What on earth is a Reynolds number? And from that, you can derive reactor features. What should this reactor look like to have that performance? So actually, it's translating her language into his language, and the two don't usually talk to each other. So if you have a route, it does by no means mean that you do have a process. You have to do all that translation of a good route into a good process. So I'll give you an example. For example, route scouting for cyclopropanes from diazo compounds. So if you have a cyclopropane, as here in the center here, you can cut it apart in various ways, either this way or that way or that way. If you cut it apart into an olefin and a diazoacetate, you get a nice cyclopropane carboxylate, but you might also cut it apart in a different way by to start from an unsaturated ester and diazomethane, for example, and you could cut it apart in still a third way to employ an acrylate and a diazoalkane. And all these things would pop up during root scouting, and you would talk about chemicals. Are the chemicals available? You would talk about yield, about byproducts, can you remove them, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to designing a process out of that, it comes to looking at the consequences of choosing a single route. For example, if you go for olefin and diazoacetate, you have to handle and generate diazoacetate. Probably do that on demand because you don't want to store it. If you go for the diazomethane route, you've got to store and handle diazomethane. So route scouting expands to process scouting, and here we're talking about investments, productivity, what does my plant look like, which features does it have, what are the integrated costs, what does it really cost, apart from the low chemicals cost a preferable route might have, and what is the lead time to implement that. What kicks in here is process intensification. Are there means to intensify a process, to shorten those lead times, or to improve on the safety of what we're doing, and to increase the productivity? I'll give you an example for that. For example, our root scouters might have had a problem to chlorinate an unsaturated nitrile. If you mix chlorine and an unsaturated nitrile, nothing happens. So you need further measures. Either you do it with light, so a radical chlorination, very old chemistry. What you find is the desired dichlorinated product, but also some overchlorinated product. So root scouters come up with a different process, so they do the chlorination in pyridine, and hooray, you get your desired product. And you read some caveats in the literature. What do you need here? Mix the substrate with 10 more% of a base, and so on and so forth, and react for 10 hours at 25 degrees. And they remark that during the first hour, a very viscous lower layer formed. You do away with that on lab scale. This viscous layer has been difficult to stir and gradually then disappeared. So where's the problem? Another literature says at high degree of conversion, chlorine adds to the product to form the trichloro derivative, our enemy, which in turn leads to side products. So this reaction occurs. So in designing a process out of this, obviously there are some regions of the reaction to avoid. So if you have your process from an energy point, the concentrations of the starting material, that will go down, the product will rise, and at a certain point, it will fall again, and a follow-up product will appear. So for the process chemist, there is a no-no at the beginning with that viscous phase, and a second no-no towards the end of the reaction. Here. So what do you do to run a process that can neither be at large concentration of starting material nor at large concentration of final product? You have to run it here at a certain defined conversion. I think hardly any organic chemist has ever thought at running a chemical reaction at one defined conversion. Usually you run it from start to finish, and then you're happy if you get some yield. So how do you do that? Chlorinate a defined mixture of starting material and product, reflecting a certain degree of conversion. That's where the process chemist kicks in. So what do? You have a reaction mixture mixed from starting material and product to reflect the situation at, let us say, 70% conversion. And you circle this reaction mixture between a vessel and a heat exchanger. And this is not a simple heat exchanger. This is a heat exchanger that allows you to add chemicals. Here you add some more starting material, some to the vessel, and some chlorine to the heat exchanger. So what will happen? This 70% conversion will seemingly fall back to, say, 65 by adding of starting material. Then you enter it into your heat exchanger, you add some chlorine, and the chlorine and the starting material will react, taking again the conversion to 80%, and then you harvest some product and return most of it to have some more reaction mixture of this desired conversion. To avoid that the conversion goes further, you blow out the chlorine from your product vessel and take it to the next step. So this is a continuous plant that will continuously chlorinate a reaction mixture at a constant conversion. Is this theory or is this practice? No, actually that's a large-scale lab plant. So, for example, here you have a temperature. You can perfectly control the temperature, in this case between 30 and 40 degrees, and you can operate the reactor over days. So we simply went home in the evening after 6 hours, and you see if you optimize the rate of chlorine addition, you don't see any difference in temperature. So the reactor is able to handle that reaction mixture. But what you see is at different rates of chlorine addition, you'll get different degrees of conversion. So you can fine-tune the conversion. Yes? So the concentration of the product rises and the concentration of the starting material is lowered. So that's a proof that it works in principle. Which tools do we use in the laboratory? Everybody starts with whatever he has or he finds in his drawer. So capillaries, falling film reactors, for example, from IMM, or structured plates as provided by equipment manufacturers like KIT, or even glass assemblies, or even modular glass reactors, such as from Chemtrix, like this one here, or from Corning, like this one here. And then, once you know the recipe, you start dealing with things like reaction energy, rate, temperature, dependence of selectivity, and so on. That's where the process chemist kicks in, and he has to understand what the organic chemist is telling him, and vice versa. And once you know all this, it's an easy game to scale further up and finally end up with this plant. This is a large-scale, full-scale production plant, and it has essentially the same reactor features as the one plant that you have used in your laboratory to design the process. So in taking this approach, you'll do away with scale-up failures. Yeah? So now, very nice to have a completely different plant, but what we're all sitting on is loads and loads of batch plants. So we have to do something about our batch plants. What do you do? So the flow process would, in a continuous flow, add A and B, for example, then add C, remove D, and then get a product. And what you have in your plant is something like this: a vessel, another vessel, probably a reaction column. And what you do now is you use these vessels as hold-up tanks between pieces of flow equipment. So in mixing A and B, you would need a flow mixer under temperature control, and the material would enter either one or the other of a pair of vessels, from where it would enter the next step, for example, the addition of C. In doing so, you will greatly simplify your startup and shutdown, because you can use these vessels as buffers. So if there is a problem in the addition pump of B, you might stop, and the section where C is added might feed on one of these vessels without having to be stopped. When it comes to removing D, use a column. A distillation column is a continuous piece of equipment per se anyway, so you only have to run it continuously. The organic chemists usually run it batch-wise. Yeah? Yeah? So, and in taking this approach, you can make great use of your existing plant and beef it up by adding pieces of flow equipment. And in doing so, you can turn nuisance into opportunities. For example, if you cannot store or use a reagent, simply don't store it, produce it on demand. If you need cryo conditions, and they, as we know, they are expensive, operate continuously at higher temperature or at higher pressure. Isn't any issue anyway, because a narrow tube will stand it. Or if you have a foreign patent, aren't you able to either circumvent it or create an own position? Or if you cannot invest in full-scale equipment, to most of us this will ring a bell, just invest in equipment of a scale that you will need for your next process. If you need higher capacity, create this capacity by parallelizing your equipment. If you have high catalyst costs, think of that you're able of applying much harsher conditions to your reaction mixture, so maybe less active catalysts will do the job as well. So, and how does this all fit into the value chain of our business partners? We can use all these techniques for anything, starting from desk studies, into route scouting, into their preclinical phase material, into their clinical development, validation campaigns, and finally into launch, without having to change processes, without having to refile and anything. So let me conclude. What we have developed here is, first of all, route scouting services to streamline complex syntheses based on our chemical and technological competencies. Then an integrated approach to design intensify processes even for hazardous materials on all scales. And last but not least, we have created various business models to meet the needs of you, of our business partners, and serve you as good as we can. I think that's been it. Thank you for listening. My name is Peter Pöchler from DSM.